Welcome to Protected Presence USA, the podcast, a podcast that offers English listeners a window into the Protected Presence movement and the reality in the West Bank that makes that activism necessary. On this episode of the podcast, I, Celeste Marcus, and Mitchell Labrador are in conversation with Sam Stein, who is an activist in the West Bank. He's been involved in various forms of activism, including Protected Presence, for the past 6 years. He came in from a religious Zionist American family, and we talk a lot about his transition into a stalwart member of the activist community in the West Bank. We talk a lot about how that evolution happened for him. And just a couple of housekeeping notes just so that you can follow the conversation. Sam refers at one point to something called Pardes, which is a Jewish learning center inside Jerusalem. He and Mitch make reference a couple of times to writings of his. And you can follow his writings on his Substack. It's called Sam Substack. His handle is Sam Avraham, and he writes regularly on Substack about his experiences in the West Bank. So you should definitely check that out if you want to hear more about his experiences and developments on the ground from Sam. Hello, Sam. Thank you so much for joining us on the Protected Presence USA podcast. Such a pleasure to have you. Could we just start with how this started for you?
Yeah, definitely. I grew up in a Orthodox, very right-wing Zionist family on Long Island in a place called the Five Towns. And if anybody knows what that is, that kind of really tells the whole story. Basically, a bunch of rich Orthodox Jewish Republicans larvaing as WASPs. And long story short, around college and young adulthood, I went on a whole political journey, really triggered by Trump round one and the support he was getting from my community, and really facilitated by one of my best friends who kind of from a much more impressively and from a much younger age than me was really inquisitive and questioning and calling out the one-sided narrative we were raised on. He has since founded the NGO Halachic Left, so shout out to him and them doing awesome work. And basically through that whole unlearning process, my family would go on vacation to Israel all the time when I was a kid. I read from the Torah at the hotel at my bar mitzvah. I have cousins all over the region, sort of inside Israel's borders and in settlements. And through this whole unlearning and relearning process, I kind of always wanted to spend more time there, and that never really went away. So again, this is, condensing a lot, but basically in 2019, I decided to go to grad school at Tel Aviv University. And with that, it was kind of just part of the deal for me. Even though I never was, an activist in college, I was not involved in the political life on campus or anything like that. I went to one J Street thing towards the very end of my undergrad, but I really felt call to action just to be involved. I was like, I can't just hang out and smoke weed on the beach in Tel Aviv and be like, no, but I'm against this. I got to do something. And I didn't know what that would mean at all. I just I want to do activism. I want to do anti-occupation work. I want to be involved. And I kind of just reached out to every single group that I could find. And long story short, a group called All That's Left is the one that really stuck and became sort of my activist home for the whole time that I was living in Israel, Palestine. And that was so for about 6 years, and I kind of just threw myself into things and, just doing everything available and finding what stuck. And that really became Protective Presence. Even though my first several trips into the West Bank, I wasn't thinking in those terms. I was just like, hey, all I know is that people that know more than me have said that this will help. So let's do it. I don't remember the first time I really heard, the phrase protective presence or thought of that as what I was doing. I will say that a huge turning point in my sort of positionality and how I related to my role in the struggle was when I did a project called Hinenu with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, Hinenu being Hebrew for, we are here, where for 3 months, activists just live in different Palestinian villages in Masafra Yatta and engage in full-time protective presence. So that was a really, really life-changing experience, and, really kind of made me feel like this is my role. This is what I want to be doing in this movement. A little over a year ago, March of last year. After a long day, I was working for an organization called Rabbits for Human Rights as a field coordinator. And basically, I spent a whole day in a village called Deir Jarir trying to help them access some land that they had a court order saying they can access. Settlers called the army and we were kicked out anyway. And then I got back to my car, which I kind of, not very smartly, parked right next to sort of a military pillbox. So you're not like a full base, but just like a little station. And basically, some soldiers came out, started asking me some questions about what I was doing there and this and that and whatever. And, I tried really hard to just sort of give short, polite answers and de escalate and get the hell out of there. And they started, getting more aggressive and kind of harassing the volunteer that was with me. And then they started filming, and then I started filming, and the soldier yelled, "You messed up. You just wasted 6 hours of your life." And then he started attacking me. He threw me to the ground and the first thing I remember after being thrown to the ground is something that like wasn't flesh hit my face. It was either a boot or his rifle. I don't really know. And he kept yelling "Dear Balak" at me in Arabic, which means like "be careful" or "watch yourself." He threatened to kill me several times if I didn't open up my phone, and blindfolded me and zip tied me and dragged me into the military base. This specific soldier, there was obviously, a whole sort of troop or battalion or whatever, but this specific soldier actually wanted to, after blindfolding me, wanted to put my head in a shopping bag, and like one or two soldiers were like, no, that's mugzam, that's overkill. And basically once I
Mugzam means exaggeration.
yeah, thank you. At some point, once after being dragged into this military base, they kind of figured out that I'm Jewish / have Israeli citizenship. And then this whole debate started of like, oh, well, now what? We thought he was Palestinian and now we could just like fucking kill him. But now we need to kind of, he's Jewish, but he's a leftist traitor or whatever. And then eventually, the debate kind of subsided. They just kind of left me there for a few hours. One of the more, I guess, gung-ho soldiers, like, kicked me a little in, like, the back of the leg. But, like, it really was night and day once they found out that I was Jewish, and they handed me over to the cops, who brought me to a police station and, interrogated me and arrested me. I think none of the charges stuck, so I guess I don't know if official charge is even, like, a real term, but basically I was accused of assaulting a soldier who in fact assaulted me. And then I was banned from like the spot of the incident for 2 weeks, which was actually great because it was just sort of this random traffic circle in the middle of the West Bank that like I had to drive around to get back to Masafriata where I was actually living at the time, and that was like annoying, but basically didn't affect my life moving forward, and then it ended.
Well, Sam, what's really amazing about your story, because people should know that you call this your 15 minutes as a Palestinian, is that in your case, now looking at you, you sure look like a young Jew to me, is that it's as Nadav Lapid says in his latest film, the soldiers have like this sixth sense for who's a Jew, and somehow it failed them in your case.
Yeah, I think it really shows, and this is kind of like its own rabbit hole, but like our notions of race are made up. Our perception of what certain people look like is made up, especially in the summer or when I'm living in Masafriata and I get tan and, parked right by Area A. All of a sudden, kind of these assumptions go out the window, even though, as you said, people tell me I look like Ben Shapiro all the time, but then also I'll be hanging out in Ramallah and people think I look Palestinian. One Palestinian kid in Ras Al Ain very specifically said I look Jordanian. And I was like, most Jordanians are Palestinians. Like, what does that even mean? So it really just shows that, it's all made up. People see what they want to see most of the time, I think.
You said that, this has to do with the dangers of hierarchy. Why does the soldier have, why is he above me? Why does he have the right to do this stuff? I'm not sure that hierarchy is the answer. It's a good anarchist answer, I have to say. Celeste and I were involved in an incident that exactly was like what Rokano went through last weekend. And when we were leaving, one of the people from the organization, from Jordan Valley Activists, said, well, this all got to do with the army. And somebody else said, oh, no, this is about education. And I said, no, this is all about Zionism. But also, that if it's about Zionism or it's about the army, or it's about education, what does that then lead you to do? So, what is, how do we address what the deeper causes are? Or do we even do it? Are we just there for the immediate event?
Yeah, I see Zionism as a manifestation of hierarchy. As you pointed out, that is a very good anarchist answer, and that's definitely sort of the political theory that I subscribe to. Whether you call it hierarchy or domination or power, this was the goal of Zionism, and I see that as, the same thing that manifests differently in other sort of atrocities and conflicts and quest for power throughout the world. And I do kind of, find myself towing the line of, as you ask, kind of doesn't matter. In a lot of ways, I kind of have a lot on my mind and feel like I have a lot to say and want to write about this stuff. And I do, and I use, some of my platforms for that. And also at the end of the day, I've always really seen my job as, like you said, protective presence is kind of, for all of the praise I will sing of it as a form of activism, as a strategy, it is kind of literally a band-aid. And there's part of me that's like, I'm not an ideas man, just like throw me out there and let me, do my thing in the field. And I've always viewed my role as to just be there and offer protective presence and show people what's happening.
It also leads to what you wrote in the most recent piece, where you were talking about like the religious, or the Jewish, specifically Jewish religious explanation for why you do it. And, I've spent a lot of time writing against giving any kind of Jewish reason for anything, any religious reason for anything, because the fact is that you really don't need religious backing or a religious explanation for doing what's basically morally, as I keep calling it, morally imperative. And giving it Jewish reasons would then kind of cut the legs out from under, well, non-Jews and atheists who want to do this. Now, I'm sure but you were clear this was your reason. But to what extent was it that, or was clearly a political feeling of yours? Is it Sam the anarchist or Sam the Jew?
When I first got into this, it was definitely a combination. I looked at what was happening and decided it was wrong, and that was not because of my Jewishness, that was because of my moral compass. I am thrilled for people who get to say that, the Judaism I was raised on has taught me that this is wrong. The Judaism that I was raised on taught me that this doesn't exist, but if it does, it's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
This was to the contrary of my upbringing.
Right.
But once I, learned and relearned and saw what was happening, my call to action, I definitely think, was Jewish. The reason I felt implicated and felt the desire and need to be involved is because of my Jewishness, because of the time that I spent in the region. I wanted to, it didn't feel like I could be removed from it. There's no, neutral, there's no middle ground. I'm either complicit or I'm part of the solution. And I think now it's kind of, the ratio is switched, but I think it's very similar. A lot of the time that I'm engaged in this work or talking to people about it, my Judaism feels like part of the background story. It's because it is wrong. It's because it's my friends who are being oppressed and I want to help. And obviously every now and then I'm like, oh yeah, I can't really uncouple my origin story from this. I can't uncouple the beginnings from this and my positionality and privilege. The privilege that I bring into this work, so much of what I have to offer in this work is because of the fact that I'm Jewish. I've worked with Palestinian communities and organizations or both that every now and then, they'll specifically want either a Jewish activist or an activist who speaks Hebrew and can deal with the cops and army for them, or who has Israeli citizenship and can't get deported. So even if I'm not constantly thinking, oh, I'm doing this because I care about my in-group and want to see it do better, it's just such an omnipresent aspect of the reality.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there are universal arguments that we both can make for why people should do this, and we do make them. But for both me and Sam, it's really hard for people who weren't raised on the kind of hatred that we were raised with to understand what that's like. It's its own very formative experience, having a community that is so comfortable with that much violence, and violence that they don't have to see, but that they are funding and that they have an enormous hand in. And I think we are children of a community that has something so specific to do with this, and we can't unsee that. And even when we're in the West Bank, like people who we really care about, who we watch lose everything. Definitely over time you've been doing protective presence for longer than I have, but I have seen people I care about lose their homes that I've slept in. And of course, there's like the version of you that is experiencing that as a human being, but there's also the version of you that's a like 15-year-old and a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old who remembers glorifying the people that are sanctioning this and who some cases are doing it. So I think that's an important piece to remember when you hear us talk about why we do this. It's not that we don't think everyone should do it. It's that we really feel like we have to do it. And I think there is a moral valence for somebody like Sam and somebody like me, whereas I don't judge people who don't do protective presence who are just like normal people. I do judge people who don't do protective presence who are people like me and Sam, who know exactly what it is that our communities, our people are being taught to believe, and how violent, how dire the price of that belief is. Does that make sense, Mitch?
Yeah. But I have to make clear. I mean, I went to an Orthodox shul, and I remember in 1974, when I decided I was going to move to Israel, I was leaving as a Baruchavist, believe it or not. And by the time I got there, I returned to being a communist, and I was just going to stay. And I remember the rabbi wanted to see me, the Flatbush Park Jewish Center, the local god, and he was a wonderful man. Anyway, he wanted to see me, and he then asked me to come to Shabbos services where he talked about, how Mitchell is moving to Israel thanks to his education at Flatbush Park. And I said to myself, I'm going there despite it, really. And in fact, I live in the part of Brooklyn that's the feeder for the settlers. The southern end of Brooklyn, is, when Kahana was killed, there was mourning all over this neighborhood. So
what was that like?
I mean, I get it. Now, but so you go out there with rabbis for human rights. And was that just pure chance that's where you ended up with instead of any of the other groups?
Yeah, so basically, after I did Hinenu, which was 2020, basically for several years, what I was doing during the day kind of changed a lot. And I really did this full treadmill that you both might be familiar with of sort of the left-wing programs and fellowships that are available for Jews living in Palestine/Israel. I did Achvat Amim, I did the Shatil Fellowship, and this and that and whatever. And kind of through all of I learned at Pardes for a bit, which, definitely a very different strain of things. I was very proud of when I was living in Khair and commuting to the Pardes Kollel 3 times a week. And after years of somehow doing whatever during the day and paying the bills and making rent and just doing a lot of protective presence as much as I could. Sometimes, just night shifts, sometimes joining a shepherd in the morning and getting home, sometimes, especially in the summer, kind of just, packing up and going to Masafriyata for a week and a half, 2 weeks or whatever. August 2024, I was hired by Rabbis for Human Rights as their field coordinator in Masafriyata, and kind of in conjunction with that, I was moving out of my apartment in Jerusalem anyway, and some others, looking for a new one just felt really stressful. And I was in Khair, and I was talking to some of the guys, and I was like, hey, what if I just move here? And they were, ecstatic about the idea. For 6 months-ish, I was working for Rabbis for Human Rights as their field coordinator. It was my job to be in Masafriyata, and I was just living in Khair, paying rent to their, village council. And, doing my job in the area and leaving to go to other parts of the West Bank, usually with RHR as well, especially around the olive harvest and the tree planting campaigns and stuff like that. But mostly as much as possible, kind of just doing full-time protective presence in Khair and the rest of Masafriyata. And definitely, grateful to RHR for that opportunity, even though it was kind of, Avi Dabu should not tell me to move to Khair.
Well, can I hit, there's something though that Celeste and I were discussing earlier in the week. I told her that while I was there, so it was the third time in a week that I'd been out in the field, and of course, so some settlers showed up, and I was with a young guy who was an Israeli who had given up and moved to Denmark. And so what happened was, the settlers show up, and there's 2 cars, one here and one there, so now we're kind of caught. And we take out our cameras, they take out their cameras. And everything happens, and in the same way every time, because your description of the cameras being put directly in the face, Happened to us the first day. 10 minutes into being out in the field, the soldiers have their cameras in our face. And so anyway, this Danish Israeli said, it's all kabuki. Everybody's got their role. And that, when like I said, the Ro Khanna incident, I have friends who called me up and said, this is exactly what you described. And, the kabuki aspect of it, so there's two variants. There's one variant where you get the shit kicked out of you. And the other variant is where, you just get scared to death, and then everybody goes about their business after everybody has played their role. And so you've been doing this for 6 years. So you've been seeing this for 6 years. And has anything substantially changed in it, other than getting maybe more violent now?
It's gotten a lot worse. It's gotten so much worse, hasn't it?
But I'm talking about in the incidents themselves.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, unfortunately, like Celeste said, it's definitely gotten way worse. I've started describing, the occupation in general and settler violence in particular as sort of a ratchet effect. It just is designed to only escalate. So, whatever escalation happens, it will crank up. I remember when the Israel-Gaza war of 2021 was the craziest thing that any of us had ever experienced, and when especially sort of the flares of violence happening around that. That was my first time being attacked by settlers. Was May 2021. Very nostalgic, and it doesn't de-escalate. That war ends. There's a ceasefire. Everything goes back to normal for Israelis living within the Green Line, and even for settlers for that matter. But they just found their new floor, their new raised threshold for baseline violence, and it doesn't go back. We saw that after October 7th. Something I started telling people a lot. In sort of November, December, January, February 2023, 2024 was like, it's not October 8th anymore, but it's never going to be October 6th ever again. So, there is some dip back down of October 2023 was terrifying. Had guns pointed at me. I was attacked by like 12 settlers with Ravarik Asherman. Settler, threatened to shoot me, and it was the first time in my entire life that I was like, holy shit, he might do it. And then things de-escalated a little, and then we saw that with every, quote-unquote ceasefire that happened. There was that would all led to escalations that like de-escalate a little bit, but the floor is still way higher than it ever was. Qualitatively, not so much, honestly. Settler violence has stayed looking in its character the same way that I've ever seen it for as long as I've been involved, with some exceptions, definitely. The phenomenon of settler soldiers, that's a very post-October 7th thing, really changed the game. And to clarify what that is, basically of settlers that just grab their army uniform that they might have from reserve duty or whatever it is, that they're not on army duty, but half the time they just throw on uniforms. Sometimes the uniforms don't even match, and they'll be wearing like, army pants but no top, or their personal boots or whatever it is, and just go and commit settler terrorism with the extra impunity of military uniform, especially because when you're an activist or a Palestinian, you can tell, you might know, but somebody in uniform is pointing a gun at you. Like, sounds like a soldier to me. And the biggest, other sort of qualitative change that's a little less about settlers, but definitely is totally shaping the reality on the ground in the West Bank, is the massively expanded use of gates to close off entire areas. Not even checkpoints, which like there's theoretically some mechanism to like wait in line and eventually get through. Just these yellow gates that I'm sure you both have seen put up outside, usually entrances to Palestinian cities and sometimes smaller villages as well. Just a yellow gate that the army closes whenever they want. And if it's closed, then it's just either walk or try again tomorrow. So those are two things that have really qualitatively changed the reality on the ground. And those are both, settler soldiers being a post-October 7th phenomenon, and these gates really being, the gates have existed forever, but the massive expansion and constructing of new ones constantly is very much since the January 2025 ceasefire.
So it's kind of like the Overton window of settler violence. It keeps moving up and up and up into degrees that previously were unthinkable. But the fact is that it's going to continue because it's in the nature of the occupation. So long as the occupation goes on, there's going to be the violence, and whether a new government would put a stop to it, there's no reason to hope for that. So again, it comes back to, if there's nobody who's willing to oppose the occupation, then the violence is going to continue, and this is going to continue to be that Band-Aid. But going with
And
that,
it has to be international pressure. It's not going to come from inside.
right? And the other part of this, Sam, is do you see the support or the number of volunteers increase for this? Because there have been calls, I went because of Avner Gvaryahu's Haaretz piece last year. And I decided right then and there, as soon as I read it, I needed to go. Has there been, a significant increase, either both within Israel and internationally, for people interested and willing to do this? And can this go on forever? I'm talking about protective presence, the way it will have to as long as there's an occupation.
There's definitely been an increase. I wish I had really good numbers on how much of an increase, but definitely just anecdotally seeing massive increase in interest and more people. The closest thing I have to sort of rigorous numbers is that every single Hinenu cohort since I was on the first one in 2021 has gotten bigger, with this last one being really huge. Mine was 5 people and this one was, I think, 12, 13, 14. So, really a big group. And even talking to activists from other groups, seeing how many people kind of have the same stories and through lines of what, made them feel called to join. Once or twice, it's been my Instagram, which is wild and crazy and, really cool and a big privilege. And even within Israeli society and, amongst Israelis, I think too, in certain extents, Rabbis for Human Rights' Olive Harvest campaign is basically getting bigger. Standing Together has gathered a lot of people for their, they call it their humanitarian guard, but it's basically them doing protective presence. So they've definitely motivated a big number of people that wouldn't get involved through other channels. Hats off to them for that. And I don't think it's sustainable, unfortunately. A friend of mine, Matan Berner Kadish, who started an organization called From Here Forward, has, I think, a very apt, slogan / soundbite of slow things down on the ground, escalate things abroad. Because of that ratchet effect, it's not sustainable. Eventually, we will get to the point where certainly non-Jewish international activists and even international Jewish activists and eventually Israeli citizens will be on the chopping block as well. And we thought that time came after October 7th and it didn't. So I'm not saying it's around the corner, but it will happen eventually. And protective presence is about slowing things down. We need the other international mechanisms to do their job and to stop things, because all we can do is slow things down.
I want to ask 2 questions. One is a very practical one, which is going to be relevant for our listeners. How much protection does your Israeli citizenship give you versus somebody like us who doesn't have it but is Jewish? And then what is the difference between somebody like us who is not a citizen and also not Jewish? What is the breakdown there? And then the other thing that I want to say, because I think just it's worthwhile to put this out there before this episode ends, the thing that you're talking about is annexation, and the thing that the settlers are there to do is push all of the Palestinians out of Area C, out of Area B, and then concentrated within Area A. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's definitely, once they're in Area A, hopefully it never comes to that, but if and when they're all shoved into Area A, then Area A is going to become the target. So that's definitely the thing that feels important to mention, even though sort of from a current strategic analysis, you're definitely right. They're outposts in Area A. That was, that used to be thought of unheard of totally impossible. The incredible Israeli activist, Tom Pollock, told me last summer that he was near one of these outposts, and he's I think it's the only one in Area A, and now I think there's probably at least 3 or 4.
Have they been sanctioned by the Israeli government as legal?
No, but as I'm sure you know, kind of it's a totally bureaucratic distinction, and they're getting complete support from the army. And, in terms of, so yeah, definitely thank you for naming sort of exactly what we're talking about. And in terms of your first question of sort of the breakdown of privilege and protection, I think that for Jews, for international non-Israeli Jews, I think that the level of protection is, I would say, basically the same from violence, especially from settler violence. I think that, ironically, they might hate us more. I think, settlers don't hate Palestinians. They don't see them as human. The same way you don't hate a dog. Whereas they hate us because we're Jewish and they view us as human and we're doing this thing that they see as wrong, but they're not. There's that upper limit for what they'll do to us, and I don't think that they kind of view Israeli citizenship as a factor. And if they in the same way that they probably don't code me as Israeli. Like, they don't care about my passport. They care about sort of my broader identity and the way I look and sound and speak and conduct myself. But obviously there's the risk of deportation and of worse, legal pushback. And we're seeing, that's another thing that we kind of thought was impossible that is now happening basically left and right. I think 5 Jewish activists have been deported since October. And to, sort of the last rung on the ladder, international non-Jews, there's a lot of broader privilege that enters the equation. If you're white or white skinned or what country you are a citizen of, etc. But at the end of the day, it's incredibly rare, but internationals have been killed by settlers, by soldiers, Rachel Corrie kind of being the most famous one when she was killed in Gaza, whenever exactly it was. But after October 7th, 2 internationals were killed in the West Bank. I believe both American, one Turkish American, and it's incredibly rare, but it's happening. Palestinians with American citizenship are killed, I would say, often, work like often sort of relative to people being murdered. And the risk of deportation is definitely way higher, So with internationals who are not Jewish, you definitely see a huge break in terms of the privilege and protection that they have. I think that we're at a point where being arrested for most non-Jewish internationals is probably basically a one-way ticket out of the country. And with that being said, they still absolutely offer a lot in terms of their protective presence and what they're able to contribute and the solidarity that they're able to offer. Even though they're at higher risk than Jews, they are at way lower risk than Palestinians.
One of the things, though, that doesn't get talked about enough is how much what goes on is also a sign of the hatred of the left as another sign of the fascization of Israel. There wasn't a day where I wasn't called an anarchist. And as a communist, I objected to that. But I remember there was the first day I had to actually explain to the other people who were with me exactly what anarchism meant because they had it all wrong. So, but that is like another thing, as you're saying, because you're there because you're a leftist, even though you're wearing the yarmulke, but you wear the yarmulke when you're out doing protective presence?
It depends. Most of the time, no.
Yeah, okay, so then you're an anarchist.
Yeah, exactly. But I am an anarchist, and when they call me, I'm like, yes, but not for the reasons you think.
But it adds like extra venom to the way because it's now just as it is in any fascist country. Hatred of the left is like so ingrained in Israelis. It's really quite something.
This was a really great conversation. Thank you so much, Sam.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you both.